Two things real quick as we begin our lesson. Finishing up the account of the Apostle John. First off, noting what today is for our country. Back in 2001, September 11th, the attack upon our nation. One of the things that I remember about that day, we always talk about what were you doing that day. One of the things I remember is that evening, I remember coming here to this building with the congregation and having a prayer meeting. And every single one of the men led a prayer. But the one that I remember, I don't remember what Brother Roy said. I don't remember what Brother Con said. I don't really remember what Dad said in his prayer. The only thing I remember from that time was Brother Hussey's prayer. And I remember Brother Hussey specifically praying that those responsible would come to salvation. It was such an amazing thought that those responsible for such an attack on our nation would come to know Jesus and to have his salvation. And really, when we think about the death of Jesus Christ and the resurrection of Jesus Christ, it was for those individuals. It's for each and every one that would know him. The second thing, as we get into our lesson, I was thinking about during the song there, number 379, Face to Face, I got to thinking, in a sense, the disciples have been with Jesus all this time. They've come to know him. They're following after him. He's become their beloved master, their rabbi, their teacher. They've come to know him closely through these 3 years, and then he's taken away from them. And he is gone for 3 days, but he comes back to them again. He comes back to them again, and he's with them for 40 days, and then he ascends up into heaven. We, as Christians, have come to know Jesus through these scriptures, through these accounts, as we saw in 1 John chapter 1. As John wrote, that we've seen his glory. We've handled him. We know him, and we want you to know him as well. We've come to know him, but we don't have him, do we? He's not here with us. But at one point, we'll receive him again. Just like the disciples did as Jesus was resurrected from the dead. They went 3 days without him. We have gone this undetermined time without him, but he's coming back again to us. We'll receive him, we'll know him, we'll see him face to face as they saw him face to face. Now, the difference is he left them after only 3 days. We'll have him for eternity. When we see him, in a sense, coming back to us, when we see him then, we'll have him for eternity. We'll be together with him forever in heaven. Coming to John chapter 20. I'm going to back up here to verse 11. Remember, the first 10 verses of this account seem to be a version of the account or a previous events that the other accounts don't record. Verse 1 through 10 seem to be something the other accounts don't have anything about. But then verse 11 and following really does start to match up with what Matthew, Mark, and Luke record. So starting there at verse 11, Mary, weeping outside the tomb, as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb, and she saw 2 angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain, one at the head and one at the feet. They said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? She said to them, They've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they laid him. Having said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. And Jesus said to her, Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, Sir, if you've carried him away, tell me where have you laid him, and I will take him away. So, coming back up here to verse 11, we've seen, real quick, back up to, I want to point out one thing right here real quick, if I can find it. There we are. In verse 2, we've seen there, she says, we do not know where they have laid him. So she's there with other women. It's not just Mary there at this time. We understand this group has come to do something with the body of Jesus. And then Mary says, we do not know where they have laid him. We don't know what's happened to the body. So they come and investigate, and then they leave. And Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, and she begins to stoop down and look into the tomb and sees the two angels in white sitting where the body of Jesus had lain. So this is a little different. The position of the angels is a little different than what we've seen in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But we have two angels, which is recorded in some of the other events. Some of them, there's only one, probably just recording the one angel that spoke. Not really mentioning the one that's just standing by, just talking about the one. Kind of like here, we understand there's more than Mary just standing around, but he only mentions Mary because Mary is the one that he's speaking to. Woman, why are you weeping? They've taken away my Lord. I do not know where they have laid him. Having said this, turning around, she saw Jesus standing, but did not know that it was him. Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking? And it's interesting, supposing him to be the gardener. If you've carried him away, tell me where you've laid him, and I will take him away. So Jesus said to her, Mary. She turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means teacher. So she didn't recognize him to begin with, and probably something like the road to Emmaus. Jesus withholding that from her, maybe to see what her response is, to see what her next action is going to be, to see what her faith is at this point. But it isn't until he calls her name that she recognizes him. And in verse 17, do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, and to my God and to your God. What he's saying here is, you've got work to do. Don't cling to me. Don't hold on to me. I'm not yet ascending back up to my Father. I'm not going up to him yet. Don't hold on to me now. I'll be here for a while. You go do the work you've got to do. No, I'm not going anywhere just yet. You go tell my brethren what you've seen. You go tell everyone that I am ascending to my Father and to your Father, and to my God and your God. And we know that it's about 40 days from this point here that's going to happen. So she goes and announces that to the disciples. I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her. Any questions or comments there before we move on? All right, on to verse 19. On the evening of that day, the first day of the week, the doors being locked where the disciples were for fear of the Jews, Jesus came to them and stood among them and said to them, Peace be with you. When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his side, and then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. And Jesus said to them again, Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, even so I am sending you. When he had said this, he breathed on them and said to them, Receive the Holy Spirit. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you withhold forgiveness for any, it is withheld. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, We've seen the Lord. He said to them, Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe. 8 days later, his disciples were inside again, and Thomas was with them. Although the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, Peace be with you. Then he said to Thomas, Put your finger here and see my hands, and put out your hand and place it in my side. Do not disbelieve, but believe. Thomas answered him, My Lord and my God. Jesus said to him, Have you believed because you have seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. Interesting, Thomas doesn't have to put his finger into the nail prints and his hand into the side. He believes. Why? Because Jesus calls him on it. The disciples were not with Jesus when Thomas said, Unless I do these things, I will not believe. But then the next time Jesus appears to them, what's he say? Thomas, here you go. Put your finger here. Put your hand here. And he knew what Thomas had said. He knew what Thomas had said to the other disciples. And so here's your chance. But Thomas just says, My Lord and my God. He believed, kind of like at the very beginning of Jesus' ministry with, now his name just escaped me, Nathaniel. I saw you under the tree. Here's an Israelite in whom is no guile. And he understood, and he said, You're the Christ. He understood he was the Christ because of what Jesus had said, even though Jesus hadn't have been there. Before your brother called you, you were under the tree. How did you know this? Well, Thomas is kind of the same way. Have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. And it's interesting there. We have not seen him, but yet we believe. Notice what the very next thing that John writes. Go ahead, Dean.
Thomas is kind of, said to be the doubting one, but if you read verse 20, Jesus immediately shows him his nail prints in his side to all the other disciples. So when Thomas says, well, I won't believe until I see that, it seems kind of mean, I guess, to place all the blame on Thomas when nobody else really believed until they saw that too.
Right.
It says that then the disciples were glad they saw the Lord.
Right. No, I completely agree. I think that I think we put too much emphasis on the doubt part of Thomas, and Thomas was such a doubter. When we look at everything about it and we think about this rationally, it's pretty hard to believe. And you're right. They saw the same things. They saw Jesus there, and so they believed in him because Jesus was there. Thomas is saying, I want the same thing. I want to see these things. I want to believe this. Almost kind of it's too good to be true kind of thing. I want to believe it, but I'm going to have to see it. And so I don't necessarily think it's doubting on Thomas's part, but he needs to see these things. He wants to believe this. He wants to believe that the Lord is resurrected. He wants to see him. He wants to be there. So I think we put too much emphasis on that doubting part. I don't think that's really fair to Thomas. Peter and the other disciples, as we saw through other accounts, were just as bad. When the women came and reported that they had seen Jesus, they didn't believe. They didn't believe until they had seen him themselves. So they're all one and the same, but we don't often remember that and don't give them that title of doubting. But Jesus says, have you believed because you've seen me? Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John uses this example of Thomas to teach us this lesson of belief. You're not going to see Jesus. You haven't seen him. You haven't seen the resurrected Lord. You haven't been able to hear his voice. You're not able to put your finger into the nail prints. You're not able to stick your hand into his side. But we've written all of these things so that you can believe. It's almost like a scrapbook, if you will. We go on a big trip and we take all these pictures and we put everything together into a scrapbook so that we can share it with our friends and family so they can see the same things that we saw. We want them to live vicariously through our experiences. We want them to see what we saw. And that's what John and the other writers have done for us here, is they've given us these snapshots of the life of Christ so that we can see who he was and what he was. We can see his dedication to the will of God. We can see his sinlessness. We can see the wisdom that he had. We can see the compassion that he had. We can see his agony. We can see his sacrifice. And we can see his deity. They've given us these snapshots of him so that we can believe. Any other questions or comments on that? All right. That is going to finish out our study there on the resurrection. So, hopefully we can tie all of these things together with this. Some of the print on the next two slides are going to be a little small. Some of it's going to be hard to read. There were two charts that I liked. One was more basic, one had a little bit more information. I unfortunately wasn't able to change the colors on it, but we'll look at those two images and then we'll go through this step by step, slide by slide, and kind of put all of these things together. What happened at the tomb? We're looking at Matthew chapter 28, 1 through 8. We're looking at Mark chapter 16, 1 through 8. Luke chapter 24, 1 through 10. And then for some reason I have John 21 through 8. But we do 1 through 10 is that beginning portion, and then 11 and following is really what matches up with the other three accounts. So we'll kind of note that as we go on. Again, I understand that this is kind of small, might be a little hard to read from the back, I'm sorry, but we have, I'll kind of explain it here. The 4 columns are our 4 Gospels, then we have the events, looking at when, at what time these things happened, looking at who comes first, looking at what did they find, what did they see, what did they do, what happens next, and then this chart has what is the third scene. And I'm not going to go into that, but that talks about in Matthew, the guards report to the chief priest and they're bribed to lie that Jesus had been stolen from the tomb. Mark doesn't have anything after that, but Luke chapter 24, we have the story of the 2 disciples on the road to Emmaus. And then in John chapter 20, this chart has Mary sees 2 angels in white seated where Jesus' body had been. But what we also see in John chapter 20 is the 2 upper room meetings. When Jesus appears to his disciples in the upper room through the locked doors, just appears to them, peace be unto you. So we'll kind of take all of those questions, the when, who comes first, what do they find, what do they see, what do they do, what happens next, as part of our chart through this study. And then this is the one that's really hard to understand and see. I'm sorry. Again, we have the 4 Gospels. Who visits the tomb? At what time of day? Why did the women come to the tomb? What was the state of the tomb upon arrival? How many angels were there? Did the angels speak to the women? Did the women see Jesus? And then after that, who did they tell after they had seen Jesus? We'll take all of that information as we go through these slide by slide. So, beginning, what time did the women arrive at the tomb? First off, Matthew records that the women arrived at dawn. We'll see who the women are here in just a moment, but Matthew records it's at dawn. Mark records just after sunrise. It's pretty close there. Luke records very early in the morning, sunrise, right at dawn. John records while it was still dark. But remember, that beginning part of John isn't the same time as what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are talking about. This is that beginning portion where the women go, they see the stone rolled, Mary turns on her heel and books it over to Peter and John and tells them the body's gone. We don't know where it is. And they come running out. So we do have a little bit of a difference there, but again, our events aren't quite the same when it talks about the time. So who came first? Matthew records Mary Magdalene and the other Mary. Mark records Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome. Luke records Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and others. And then John just records Mary Magdalene. So again, not really a discrepancy. Yeah, we have all these other groups. Mary Magdalene is the chief one mentioned among there. She's mentioned in every single gospel. We see that she's the one that Jesus talks to originally. She's the first one that he speaks to. And so John just mentioning Mary doesn't really cancel out the other women. Doesn't mean that the other women aren't there. We saw in John 20 and verse 2 how she says, we do not know where they have taken him. So we can safely see the other women there in that story, but they're not the ones that the angel is talking to, conversing with the angel, nor are they the ones that Jesus speaks to first, so John leaves them out of the story. What did they find when they get to the tomb? Matthew records an earthquake with an angel who rolls away the stone. Mark records a stone rolled away. Luke records the same thing. And John says the stone rolled away from the entrance. Now the others don't record an earthquake, nor do they record the angel rolling away the stone. But they also don't tell us how the stone was rolled away. So it does leave it open, doesn't it? That stone had to be rolled away somehow. Whether or not they record that it was an angel that did it or not, that stone had to be rolled away somehow. So we can pretty much easily say, yeah, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John record that there was an earthquake and an angel rolled away the stone. Whom did they see when they arrived to the tomb? Matthew records they saw an angel sitting on the stone. Mark records a young man in white robes sitting on the right. And I wonder if that's the reason why in all the pictures of the tomb and everything, we always see the stone rolled away to the right-hand side. The angel sitting on the tomb, the young man sitting on the right, or sitting on the stone, the young man sitting on the right. Kind of makes sense to me. Luke records two men in clothes that gleamed like lightning. So we have a white robe. We have a gleaming bright robe. John records no one at first because they just see the stone rolled away, and Mary goes and tells, and then Peter and John come and they go into the tomb, and then they move out, and then she sees two angels in white sitting where Jesus had lain. Like we said last week, why do the angels have to be stationary? Can they not move about as all the women are moving about? Can they not change places and be in different spots? There's nothing that says they have to stay glued to the stone or stay sitting on the right, or that they have to be both of them sitting right there where Jesus had lain. There's nothing there about that, right? So they see two angels there at the tomb. All right, so what do? Matthew records that Mary runs to tell his disciples. Mark records that they fled away from the tomb, afraid to say anything. Luke records that they told what happened to the 11 and to others. And then, of course, John records at first, Mary runs to tell Peter and the disciple whom Jesus loved, and then Mary's waiting at the tomb and talks to Jesus and supposes him to be the gardener. And then what happens? Matthew records that Jesus meets them. Of course, talks to Mary at that point. Mark doesn't record anything about it. Luke records that Peter goes to the tomb to investigate after the report comes from the women. We know from John that it's probably at the beginning that Peter comes to the tomb to investigate. John records Peter and the other disciple investigates, and then after they return, Mary is commanded. Jesus said to her, "Do not cling to me, for I have not yet ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I'm ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Why did the women come? What was the point of coming to the tomb? Matthew records that they came to see the tomb. Mark records to anoint Jesus with spices. Luke records to bring the spices they had prepared. And John doesn't have anything about the reason why they came to the tomb. But again, we don't really see any discrepancies there, do we? We haven't seen anything that, once we lay it out like this, that is any different in the accounts. What we have here is really just eyewitness accounts. Just like I started at the beginning of the lesson talking about September 11th. And one of the things that I remembered. And there were so many men that led prayers that night. But I only remember very few words from one man. Somebody else, I'm sure Brother Kahn could probably remember every single word that every single person said, every single person that led a prayer, and probably the order of the people that led it. Does it mean I'm wrong? Doesn't mean he's wrong. We just remember different things. We just focus on different things. It's really all we've got right here, isn't it? How many angels were seen? Matthew records one angel. Mark records at least one angel. And the reason I say that is because Mark doesn't say it's an angel. Mark just says that it's a young man in a white robe sitting on the right. We assume it's an angel because that's who converses with Mary, and by the other accounts, we see them as angels, but Mark just records it as a young man. Doesn't say anything about it being an angel. And then Luke records two, and of course John records two. John records him sitting where Jesus had lain. So, again, do we have discrepancies here? We know there were other women at the tomb, but John only records one woman there at the tomb. So it could be the same thing with Matthew and Mark, that they're just focusing on the spokesperson.
That's the point. You make it good on the earthly side of it, explain that. How many men were here that night? How many great? Well, all of them, right?
Mm-hmm.
How many you remember?
The one.
So who would be the primary if I was writing the prayer that night? I would say read September the 11th, 2001, praise, blah, 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 blah,
Right.
blah, blah, blah. He remembered what another brother said. Does that make null and void what everybody else said?
Not at all.
Not at all.
So, we know we have two angels there at the tomb. Again, not a discrepancy. What did the angels speak? Matthew records, we see that they spoke in verse 5 through 7, and I didn't take time to actually put all these out and build the slides up and such, but we have their words there in 5 to 7. Mark records, yes, they did speak in verse 6 and 7. Now they say essentially the same thing. What are you looking for? Why are you looking for him here? He's risen. Go tell his disciples. Luke records that they speak in verse 6 and 7. And then in verse 13, John records that the angels speak. So, again, no discrepancy there. Did the women see Jesus when they had gone to the tomb? Matthew records, yes, as they went to tell the disciples. Verse 9 through 10. Mark records he appeared first to Mary Magdalene in verse 9. Luke records nothing about whether they saw Jesus or not. John records, yes, they did see, in verse 14. Who did the women tell about this? Matthew doesn't have who she went to, but she's instructed to go tell. Mark records that Mary told those who had been with him. Luke records to the 11 and to all the rest. And then John records Peter, John, and the other disciples. Peter, the disciple whom he loved, or the other disciple, and then the other disciples. So Matthew's a little different there. It doesn't say who she goes to tell, but she's instructed to tell his disciples. All the other accounts say she went to his disciples. Do we have a discrepancy? Not at all. Now, I meant to do this at the beginning, so this is going to take me a little bit to click all the way back to the beginning slide here. I chose the picture at the very beginning on purpose because I wanted to see if we noted anything about that is inaccurate. And I see it in just about every single recreation of the tomb scene.
Take it from the inside.
Well, not that, but the linens. They're not folded. In just about every single tomb scene, the linens are just scattered. Now, it doesn't actually say that the one that he was wrapped up in, they were perfectly folded. It only mentions that the napkin or the face cloth was folded, but it does say that they were set. We understand, like we talked about last week, they were set in order. Every single tomb scene has these things just scattered about. So I chose that on purpose just to see if we could if we could see that detail. Of course, we don't know what the tomb looked like. We don't know what was in. We don't know whether, we have a good indication because there's these things all over all over the garden there. There's these tombs there. So we kind of know what they look like inside, and we know that there's this stone table that the body is going to lay on, and later they're going to go back to that tomb, and they're going to gather the bones, and they're going to bury them properly. But it's always amazing that anytime we see a Bible recreation, a picture, that there's always some type of inaccuracy in it. The linen cloths right here, they're just kind of scattered. You look at pictures and accounts of Noah's Ark, and those are always off. We have some little boat that has a window set in the side of it and a door set in the side of it. The window was open in the top. It was set 1 cubit above. You had this space that's 18 inches or so that goes all the way around the whole boat, and the top is over the top of it. I mean, there's always something like that there.
Be surprised how many people I'll tell that too. But they couldn't.
Right.
Because God designed this thing, dimensions are perfect to what a photo craft should be.
Right.
My understanding is some of that thought is still used in design even today. We know we're doing on more massive
Right,
scale.
barges and such, yeah.
Right. But what was that window has a using, or that eave opening 18 inches?
Ventilation.
Much hot air and all.
Ventilation. Right.
So you have to do the same thing instead of using, electric power vent. Now, they found this just as well, just to run the vent thing down the center of the roof and just let the natural flow of air just take care of the heat.
Right. Yep.
So really it's
So-
simple when you start to think about it. You know? But anyway, what the accepted fact is, or back it up, the accepted thought is there was, I guess, an 18 by 18 window
Right.
like this, and every once in a while, Noah poked his head out, and the door, you know, or thing, we know the door was there.
Right.
But yeah, I'm glad you brought it up, because how many times I've said something like that. Oh, when it's talking about it, you look back, look, see what they done, how they define window and all like that, it was not open. It was done like,
Right. So we hear all these stories. We've known these Bible stories from a young age as children. If we've grown up in the church, we hear all these things, we have all these things, and then we start to study, and all of a sudden, well, I don't remember that. That's different than what I remember. That doesn't seem anything like what I had in mind. And the point that I'm making out of this is to show us how important it really is to study. How important it really is to know. We know the story of the resurrection, but it is good to go back and to see the details of it and to put it in its order and to see that no, there really isn't any of these discrepancies. When we kind of lay everything out like that and chart it out like that, they kind of all disappear, don't they? Especially when we realize that the difference, if we're trying to take the beginning of John chapter 20, those first 10 verses, and match it up with verse 1 through 8 of Matthew and Mark, and then 1 through 6 or whatever, or Luke, if we're trying to match those up, no, it's not going to fit. There's things that are completely different in there because it's not the same part of the story. We realize that if we take the later part after Peter and John are gone and we move that up and start to match that up with the other accounts, all of a sudden it fits in there like a hand in a glove. But it takes us actually studying and digging down and looking at that. And so I hope that's what this study in the miracles has done for us. I hope that there have been some things throughout it. I know for me that it has, that we've heard all these stories before, but actually going back and looking in detail at these stories and reading them out and noticing them in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and comparing the four Gospels together, each one of these accounts as they happen, and putting this together, I hope it's really opened up our eyes and we've learned a lot more about just what Jesus has done. And it's mind-boggling to think of the miracles that he performed, how long it's taken us to go through this study on the miracles, to think that not everything's been recorded. That many other signs were done in the presence of his disciples. And John writes that were they written, I suppose that the world could not contain the whole. No, exaggeration, probably, but he did a lot in that short 3-year period. He did a lot. But the most important thing that he did was that he accomplished the will of God. All those miracles and all those things that he did were simply there to show that he was the Christ, that what he was doing was ordained by God, that it was God's will, that it was the plan of salvation, that he was the true Messiah to come into the world to bring salvation to God's people. Now we're going to back up. We'll follow the same pattern that we have with the miracles, just looking at them starting in Matthew and working over to John. But we're going to go to the parables now and start through all the parables of Jesus. I may borrow some outlines from some different things as we go through it and put those up on the screen and such. But we'll look at the parables next. Then after the parables, we'll look at the individual interactions. The woman at the well, the Samaritan woman there. We'll look at like the woman caught in adultery, Jesus riding in the sea. All those different things that don't have a miracle or a parable assigned to them, and to catch those. Then we'll look at the crucifixion. We've already seen the resurrection, so after that, we'll look at the ascension in the beginning of the church, and that will close out our study in the life of Christ. Another 3 years worth of study to get through all of that, but I hope the miracle part has been good. That's all that I have, so I know we're just a little bit earlier than what we normally do, but 278.
I know you're gonna cover what Jesus wasn't saying and all that.
Definitely. 278. Tell me the story of Jesus. There's a lot of stories that impact each and every one of us. There's a lot of people that come and go through our lives that leave an imprint on us, that leave their story within us. We have their memories. We do things in honor of them. We live according to how they lived because they're so important to us. Talked about some of those this evening. But there's no one more important than the story of Jesus. And we have our cherished loved ones that have gone on before us, and we keep their memories alive and strong within our lives. But there's no one more important than Jesus. This story, when we see that Jesus had become the express image of his glory, the imprint of his glory, and that we are supposed to be a small part of that. He is supposed to have such an impact into our lives that when the world looks at us, that's who they see. When we look at others around us, we look at kids and we're like, they are the spitting image of their father. Or she's just a spitting image of her mother. When the world looks at us, the story of Jesus ought to have impacted us so much that when they see us, they say, we're the spitting image of Christ. We're just like him. And it's humbling to think, but that's how God looks at us. Even as marred and even as imperfect as we are, when we're covered by the blood of Jesus Christ, we are the image of Christ. That story of Jesus ought to have such an impact on our lives. Does it this evening? If not, what do we need to do in order to change that image? In order to take on more and more of him?